Normal life fails quietly before it collapses loudly. Long before the highways clog with stalled vehicles and the grocery shelves empty, there is a subtle shift in the structure that keeps modern civilization stable. Electrical grids flicker under stress, logistics software begins routing shipments around missing inventory, and municipal systems start operating on backup contingencies designed only for temporary disruptions. Most people never notice this phase. They assume collapse is a cinematic moment, a single event when everything suddenly stops. In reality, systemic failure behaves more like pressure building inside a sealed vessel. When the release finally happens, it appears sudden, but the conditions that made it inevitable have already been building for weeks, months, sometimes years. And when that release happens, millions of people simultaneously make the same decision. Leave. The instinct to evacuate during a large-scale disruption is deeply human. When urban infrastructure begins failing, power outages spreading across districts, water pressure dropping, communications degrading, the first survival reflex is movement. Families pack vehicles, gather essential belongings, and attempt to reach what they believe will be safer territory. Rural relatives, distant towns, forest cabins, or any location that feels farther from the failing system. This instinct forms the foundation of what the preparedness community calls a bug-out plan. But the dangerous reality is that most people misunderstand what that plan actually requires. They imagine escape as a simple relocation. Drive away from the problem and safety will naturally follow. Yet large-scale evacuations historically produce the opposite effect. Movement during systemic failure becomes the most dangerous phase of the entire event. Emergency management research repeatedly demonstrates that infrastructure collapse produces cascading bottlenecks. Transportation networks are designed for efficiency under normal conditions, not for mass evacuation. Highways that appear enormous during daily commuting can only sustain a limited flow rate before gridlock begins forming. Once density reaches a critical threshold, traffic no longer behaves like a moving system but like a static barrier. Vehicles stop, engines idle, fuel burns, tempers rise, and eventually the roadway itself becomes a trap. The misconception is that leaving early guarantees safety. In reality, leaving without understanding how evacuation systems fail can place someone directly inside the most chaotic environment the disaster creates. This misunderstanding emerges because most people think about disasters in isolation. They imagine a storm approaching or a localized blackout affecting a single city. But modern civilization operates through deeply interconnected networks. Electrical grids power fuel pumps. Fuel distribution enables transportation. Transportation enables food logistics. Communication networks coordinate emergency response. When one layer collapses, pressure spreads into the others. A grid-down event, for example, does not simply mean darkness in homes. It means gas stations cannot pump fuel without generators. Traffic lights fail, creating uncontrolled intersections. Cellular networks degrade as backup batteries drain. Within hours, the simple act of navigating across a city becomes exponentially more complicated. The hidden science behind effective evacuation planning is not speed. It is timing, route intelligence, and system awareness. Engineers who study transportation resilience use a concept called network saturation. Every roadway has a maximum throughput determined by lane capacity, entry points, and driver behavior. When demand exceeds that throughput, congestion spreads backward through the network like a shockwave. Drivers entering the system later encounter the stalled mass created earlier, and eventually the entire corridor freezes. This phenomenon is measurable and predictable. Historical evacuations during hurricanes provide clear evidence. In multiple U.S. coastal evacuations, highways designed to carry hundreds of thousands of vehicles per day reached immobility within hours once a critical density threshold was crossed. This leads to a critical survival implication. The safest evacuation is often the one that happens before most people recognize the need to evacuate. But recognizing that moment requires understanding signals that the general population ignores. These signals are not dramatic explosions or visible panic. They are small indicators within infrastructure behavior. Freight delivery delays begin appearing in distribution centers. Fuel stations start receiving reduced shipments. Municipal authorities quietly stage emergency equipment near key facilities. These are the early stress indicators of a system approaching instability. Individuals who notice them gain something extremely valuable during a collapse scenario: time. Time fundamentally changes the mathematics of survival movement. With time, routes remain open. Fuel remains available. Communication networks still function. Law enforcement and emergency responders maintain order. Without time, those advantages disappear. Evacuation becomes improvisation, and improvisation under pressure is where most survival plans fail. Studies in crisis psychology show that humans revert to familiar patterns when under stress. Drivers choose highways they normally commute on. Families travel toward places they have visited before. Entire populations concentrate along predictable routes because the brain prefers certainty over analysis during emergencies. That predictable concentration is exactly what creates the deadly congestion patterns observed in large evacuations. Another overlooked factor is resource consumption during movement. A typical passenger vehicle idling in traffic can burn between half a gallon to a gallon of fuel per hour depending on engine size and environmental conditions. During prolonged congestion, vehicles begin running out of fuel long before reaching safety. Once a single car stops in the middle of a saturated evacuation route, it becomes an immovable obstruction. Multiply that by thousands of vehicles and the entire roadway transforms into a static barrier field of abandoned cars. Emergency vehicles struggle to pass. Supply trucks cannot reach staging areas, and the transportation system collapses into a physical maze of steel. Evidence for this pattern appears repeatedly across different disasters. During Hurricane Rita in 2005, evacuation traffic from Houston became so severe that portions of the highway system stalled for nearly an entire day. Vehicles overheated in extreme heat. Fuel shortages spread along the route. Some evacuees spent over 20 hours attempting to travel distances normally completed in 3. Similar congestion events have occurred during wildfire evacuations in California and earthquake-related evacuations in parts of Asia. Each event reinforces the same principle. Mass evacuation without strategic planning amplifies danger rather than reducing it. The survival implication becomes increasingly clear. A bug-out plan is not simply about leaving. It is about leaving intelligently, with an understanding of infrastructure behavior and human psychology. The difference between a successful evacuation and a catastrophic one often comes down to preparation that happens long before the crisis begins. Route redundancy, timing analysis, and logistical self-sufficiency transform movement from desperation into strategy. Without those elements, the act of fleeing can place individuals inside the most unstable part of the collapsing system. But transportation failure is only the first layer of complexity. As evacuation routes begin saturating, another dynamic starts emerging beneath the surface of the crisis. Resource competition. When large populations move simultaneously, every essential supply becomes part of the equation: fuel, water, food, medical access, and safe shelter. Movement concentrates demand into narrow geographic corridors. Gas stations along major highways become overwhelmed within hours. Grocery stores near evacuation routes experience rapid depletion. Even rest areas become contested spaces as travelers search for basic necessities. This resource compression creates a secondary crisis that many evacuation plans never account for. Understanding how this pressure builds requires examining how supply chains operate under normal conditions. Modern logistics networks rely on continuous flow. Warehouses hold limited inventory because products are constantly moving between distribution centers, retailers, and consumers. When transportation disruptions interrupt that flow, restocking stops almost immediately. Stores that appear fully stocked one day can become empty within a single afternoon of panic purchasing. During evacuation scenarios, this depletion happens even faster because thousands of travelers pass through the same locations simultaneously. As the evacuation wave expands outward from the affected region, these supply disruptions spread along the same transportation corridors people are using to escape. In effect, evacuees are chasing resources that are disappearing ahead of them. The further they travel, the more competition they encounter from others who left earlier or from residents in those regions, preparing for potential spillover effects. This phenomenon transforms evacuation routes into temporary economic shock zones where basic supplies become scarce long before the disaster itself reaches those areas. What most people fail to realize is that emergency planners have studied this pattern extensively. The conclusion from decades of disaster research is surprisingly counterintuitive. In many scenarios, remaining in place with adequate preparation can be safer than joining an uncontrolled evacuation. Infrastructure systems are often restored faster in areas where populations remain stable because emergency responders can operate without massive civilian congestion. When everyone attempts to leave simultaneously, those same responders must divide attention between disaster mitigation and traffic management, slowing recovery for everyone involved. Yet there are situations where staying is not viable. Flood zones, wildfire paths, industrial accidents, or structural failures in urban infrastructure can make evacuation necessary. The key distinction lies in how that evacuation is executed. A scientifically informed bug-out strategy focuses on avoiding the predictable failure points that trap most people. It treats movement as a calculated operation rather than a desperate reaction. And as we move deeper into the mechanics of collapse scenarios, another overlooked variable begins shaping the entire equation of survival movement: information failure. Communication networks, which normally guide navigation and emergency coordination, begin degrading precisely when people need them most. Navigation apps lose data connectivity. Cellular networks become overloaded. Radio channels fill with fragmented reports. Without reliable information, evacuees begin making decisions based on incomplete or outdated data. That moment when information disappears is when the real danger of evacuation begins to escalate. And understanding how that communication breakdown unfolds is the next critical piece of the bug-out plan most people never see coming. The moment communication systems begin to fail, the structure of modern decision-making collapses with them. Under normal conditions, people navigate the world through a constant stream of invisible information. GPS satellites synchronizing location, cellular towers transmitting traffic updates, logistics systems reporting supply availability, and digital maps recalculating routes every few seconds. These tools quietly manage enormous complexity, allowing millions of individuals to move through transportation networks without understanding how those networks actually function. But when a large-scale disruption occurs, power instability, telecommunications failure, or data congestion, the flow of information slows, fragments, and eventually disappears. At that moment, millions of travelers who have come to rely on automated navigation suddenly find themselves operating without situational awareness. The danger emerges not only from the loss of data but from how people respond to that loss. Behavioral studies in crisis environments show that individuals tend to trust outdated information longer than they should. Drivers continue following navigation routes that were calculated before the disruption began. Evacuees travel toward fuel stations that appear open on their screens even though those locations ran out of supply hours earlier. Entire streams of vehicles may converge on intersections or highways that are already blocked because the data guiding them is no longer synchronized with reality. The result is a powerful feedback loop. Inaccurate information funnels more vehicles into already saturated routes, which in turn creates further congestion and confusion. The misunderstanding most people have about evacuation planning is believing that digital tools will continue functioning during the crisis. Modern infrastructure is incredibly resilient in localized outages, but widespread stress pushes those systems beyond their design limits. Cellular networks, for example, operate through a distributed grid of towers that handle a finite number of connections at any given time. During emergencies, the number of devices attempting to connect can increase several 100% within minutes. When that happens, towers begin rejecting connections to maintain stability. To the user, the effect appears as dropped calls, failed messages, or navigation apps that freeze while attempting to update. But from a systems perspective, what is happening is a form of controlled collapse designed to prevent the entire network from shutting down. The hidden science behind communication failure during disasters involves the concept of network congestion. Data networks operate similarly to highways. Each tower and switching center can process only a certain volume of information per second. When the volume exceeds that threshold, packets of data begin queuing, waiting for processing time. If the queue grows too large, the system starts discarding new packets to protect core operations. This means that while emergency responders may retain priority access to the network, ordinary civilian devices experience severe disruption. In a rapidly unfolding evacuation, this creates a dangerous information vacuum where millions of people attempt to make critical decisions without reliable guidance. Evidence for this pattern has been documented repeatedly in major disasters. After the 2011 earthquake and tsunami in Japan, cellular networks experienced extreme congestion within minutes as millions attempted to contact family members simultaneously. Communication failure persisted for hours, leaving many residents without access to real-time updates. Similar effects were observed during major hurricanes along the Gulf Coast, where cellular towers lost power or became overwhelmed by connection attempts. Even when the physical infrastructure remained intact, the surge in traffic effectively rendered the networks unusable for large portions of the population. The survival implications of this phenomenon are profound. A bug-out plan that depends entirely on real-time digital information is structurally fragile. When the network disappears, the plan disappears with it. This is why professional emergency planners still rely heavily on analog systems that many civilians have forgotten how to use. Paper maps, pre-planned routes, radio communication, and local geographic knowledge become critically important when digital guidance collapses. These tools do not depend on servers, satellites, or cellular towers. They function independently of the technological ecosystem that normally supports modern navigation. Yet even among those who understand the value of offline navigation, another misconception persists. Many assume that simply possessing a map is enough to guarantee safe movement. In reality, maps are only tools for understanding terrain. They do not reveal how populations will behave during a crisis. When a major disruption begins, traffic does not distribute evenly across the road network. Instead, it concentrates along a few predictable corridors that most drivers instinctively choose. Major highways, interstate routes, and well-known arterial roads become magnets for evacuation traffic because they are the routes people are most familiar with. This behavioral pattern creates a paradox. The roads that appear most efficient on a map are often the ones that fail first during mass movement. Large highways funnel enormous volumes of vehicles into limited exit points, creating choke points where congestion rapidly multiplies. Smaller regional roads, on the other hand, may appear slower under normal conditions but can remain functional longer because fewer drivers consider them viable escape routes. Transportation engineers refer to this concept as network redundancy, the presence of multiple pathways that distribute traffic pressure across a system. Hidden within this concept is a strategic advantage that many evacuation plans overlook. A carefully designed bug-out strategy prioritizes route diversity rather than speed. Instead of relying on a single highway corridor, it incorporates multiple potential pathways that can be chosen depending on real-time conditions. These routes are studied and practiced in advance so that they remain usable even without digital navigation. Understanding where secondary roads intersect with primary highways, where bridges create unavoidable bottlenecks, and where urban density increases congestion risk allows travelers to adapt quickly when circumstances change. Evidence supporting this approach comes from transportation modeling used by emergency planners. Simulation studies demonstrate that even a small percentage of drivers using alternative routes can dramatically reduce congestion across the entire network. Conversely, when the majority of evacuees converge on the same highways, the system collapses much faster than predicted. This explains why official evacuation orders during hurricanes often assign specific zones to different routes. Authorities attempt to distribute traffic across the network to prevent saturation. Unfortunately, compliance with those instructions is inconsistent, especially when panic begins spreading through the population. Panic introduces another layer of complexity into evacuation dynamics. As uncertainty grows and information becomes scarce, human behavior becomes less predictable. Drivers may abandon planned routes to chase rumors of open roads or available fuel. Some attempt dangerous maneuvers such as driving against traffic flow or using shoulders to bypass congestion. These actions may appear rational from an individual perspective, but collectively they destabilize the entire transportation system. Accidents become more frequent, blocking lanes and slowing movement even further. Law enforcement resources quickly become overwhelmed, unable to manage the sheer volume of vehicles and incidents occurring simultaneously. This escalation reveals an uncomfortable truth about large-scale evacuations. The greatest threat often comes not from the disaster itself but from the chaos generated by the evacuation process. When millions attempt to relocate at once, infrastructure designed for stability becomes a fragile system under extreme strain. Roads, fuel supplies, communication networks, and emergency services all face simultaneous pressure. If the movement is poorly planned, that pressure can trigger secondary failures that extend far beyond the original disaster zone. Yet there is another factor quietly shaping the outcome of these scenarios, one that operates beneath the visible layers of traffic and communication. It is the fundamental biological requirement that governs human survival more strictly than any other resource during movement: water. While fuel shortages and traffic congestion capture most public attention during evacuations, dehydration becomes a hidden risk that grows steadily as travelers remain trapped in stalled vehicles or walking long distances after transportation fails. Human physiology begins experiencing measurable decline after only a few hours without adequate hydration, especially under conditions of stress or heat. Cognitive performance deteriorates, reaction times slow, and decision-making becomes impaired. During prolonged evacuations where vehicles remain stationary for hours or even days, access to clean drinking water becomes critically important. Yet many evacuation plans assume that travelers will simply purchase water along the route. This assumption collapses quickly once supply chains are disrupted and stores begin running out of inventory. Scientific studies on disaster resilience consistently highlight water availability as one of the most important variables in survival outcomes. The average adult requires roughly 2 to 3 liters of water per day under moderate conditions, and significantly more during heat exposure or physical exertion. When thousands of evacuees converge on the same supply points, gas stations, convenience stores, roadside markets, those locations can be emptied within minutes. Without preparation, travelers may find themselves trapped in stalled traffic with limited access to hydration, while temperatures rise and stress levels increase. The implications of this resource vulnerability extend far beyond personal comfort. Dehydration reduces cognitive clarity, making it harder for individuals to assess changing conditions or adapt their plans. Drivers experiencing fatigue and dehydration are more likely to make mistakes that lead to accidents, further worsening congestion. Families traveling with children or elderly members face even greater risk, as these groups are more sensitive to fluid loss. What begins as a logistical inconvenience can escalate into a medical emergency within a surprisingly short period. As evacuation conditions deteriorate and essential resources become scarce, the bug-out plan evolves from a transportation strategy into something far more complex. Movement is no longer simply about reaching another location. It becomes a test of endurance, preparation, and adaptability in an environment where the supporting systems of modern life are progressively shutting down. And as those systems fail one by one, first communication, then transportation, then supply distribution, the reality of large-scale societal disruption becomes impossible to ignore. Because once resource scarcity spreads along evacuation routes, another transformation begins occurring within the affected population. Cooperation starts giving way to competition. Travelers who once shared information about road conditions begin guarding their supplies. Fuel stations that still have gasoline may attract long lines that stretch for miles, creating tension among those who fear they will run out before reaching the pump. Small misunderstandings escalate quickly when thousands of exhausted people are confined within a narrow corridor of limited resources. This shift in human behavior marks the next escalation point in the anatomy of a collapsing evacuation system. And understanding how social dynamics evolve under these pressures may be the most overlooked component of the bug-out plan that few people are truly prepared for.